So the last section here is on the anatomy of the spinal cord. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the gross anatomy. So the spinal cord itself is only about 18 inches long and about half an inch wide. So if you take a look at your index finger, that's about how wide and about how fat your spinal cord is. As you move down the spinal cord from your brain towards your belly button, the diameter actually decreases, except in two locations. The first one is an area just above the base of the neck. So basically if you reach behind your neck and find that little knob there from where you bend your neck forward, about there is a place called the cervical enlargement. And the reason why it's wider there is because all of the nerves for the shoulder and the upper limb come in and out at that location. Then it's going to taper down until a spot that is just basically about where your ribs end, and that is the lumbar enlargement. And again, that's because it's where many of the nerves for the pelvis and the lower limbs come in and out of the spinal cord. The spinal cord itself is actually anchored down at the coccyx, and this is a section of the pelvis. So basically what this anchoring does is it actually provides the spinal cord with the stretch that it needs so it's not springing up inside of the vertebral column. The true spinal cord itself only extends to the first or second lumbar vertebrae, so it's about at the level of your belly button is where it ends. Below that point, though, we do have nervous tissue that continues to extend downward through the vertebral column or through the vertebral cavity, and these are the dorsal and ventral roots of the spinal cord. Alright, so below that ending point, there are long dorsal and ventral roots that actually come off the spinal cord, and they create these thread-like extensions. And when the early anatomists first saw this and identified this, they thought it reminded them of a horse's tail. And so this feature actually has a name that basically means horse's tail, cauda equina. You can see caudal, our directional term that we learned about in Unit 1. And equina, if you think of equine or equestrian, you can definitely see that root of horse in that name. So taking a look here, we've got the two diagrams of the spinal cord, the two halves. So as it comes down out of the brain, you can see here we have the cervical enlargement basically at the base of the neck. And then it continues to gradually taper down until you get to the lumbar enlargement where it kind of fattens back up again. The ending tip of the true spinal cord, again, is about at the level of your belly button, but you can see here we have these long extensions that come down all the way into the pelvis, and that creates that horsetail appearance with the cauda equina that we talked about before. All right, within the spinal cord, we have a very narrow central canal that we had looked at with the ventricles, and I had pointed out. It is contiguous with the ventricles, and so therefore it is also filled with cerebrospinal fluid just like they are. If I look at some other features, some very visible features, we can see two kind of grooves in the spinal cord. The first one is called the posterior median sulcus. And if you remember from the brain, a sulcus is a shallow groove. So this is a shallow groove on the back side of the spinal cord. And on the front side, we have the anterior median fissure. So this is very deep into the spinal cord. These two grooves actually can help you to orient the spinal cord correctly so that you know which side is anterior and which side is posterior. If I look at this cord itself, it's actually made up of 31 segments, and each of the segments shares some specific features. Each of them has two dorsal root ganglia. So on the dorsal root side, we're going to see two knobs or two bumps, and these are the sensory neuron cell bodies located in there. Each of them has two dorsal roots. And when I talk about two, I mean one on each side, right versus left, and you'll see what I mean on the diagram. In addition, there are ventral roots that contain the axons of the motor neurons coming from the central nervous system to the body. Now, these dorsal roots and ventral roots bind together. It almost looks like they come together like the two parts of a twist tie as they come off to form the spinal nerve. So now what I want you to do, we're going to kind of label and take a look at some of these features that we've discussed before we move on. So I want you to find the diagram in your notes that looks like this, because that's one we're going to be working with. All right, take that out of there. All right, so we're going to label some of this diagram now, and then we will label some of this diagram later. If you look at this, you can actually, this is what I was talking about in terms of having to orient yourself with the spinal cord. Okay, these are the two grooves here that I was talking about. And if you look here, this front one is much more deep. It comes closer to the center than the back one. So this is the shallow one, the posterior medium sulcus, and then this one is the deep one, which is the anterior median fissure. They're in the middle of the spinal cord. So this tells me that this side over here is the back side, okay, towards your back, and then this one is towards your front, towards your belly side. And that actually is very important to distinguish some of the other features. But there's a couple that are labeled on here that will actually help us as well. First of all is the bulb area here with this line. And this represents the dorsal root ganglion. And you can see we have two, one on either side. So this tells me as well, seeing this bump tells me that this side is the dorsal side or the back side of the body. You can see that there's none located here on the ventral side. So that's a really key feature if you've got those roots attached to tell you what those are. That dorsal root ganglion contains the cell bodies of the sensory neurons, and then in this one here would be the axons of those sensory neurons. So this here is the dorsal root that feeds into the spinal cord. On the other side, where we don't have that dorsal root ganglion, right below that labeled is the ventral root. And then kind of back over to the other side underneath the dorsal root ganglion, you can see how these two kind of come together and merge, and this is your spinal nerve. Okay, so those are those key features that we've already talked about. So let's take a look at a couple of others. If we look at the anterior median fissure and the posterior median sulcus, essentially what we do is we almost split the spinal cord into a left side and a right side completely. There is that small gap of tissue that connects the both sides, but you can really see how it's divided into left and right halves. In those left and right halves, we have gray matter. And gray matter makes an H, just depends on your diagram. Some of them look more like a butterfly shape around that central canal, and those contain the cell bodies that are embedded within the spinal cord. These gray matter, like the wings of the butterfly or the legs of the H, are called horns. And we have three different horns within the gray matter. We have the posterior gray horns, which contain the sensory nuclei, the anterior gray horns, which have the nuclei of the skeletal motor neurons, and then the lateral gray horns have the motor nuclei of the neurons that supply our internal organs with nerves. Now, the two halves of the legs or the wings are connected in the middle with more gray matter, and that is referred to as the gray commissure. If you look in that area of the gray commissure, you have some gray matter, and then on either side of that you have the white matter. Those commissures contain the axons that are crossing the sides of the spinal cord. And basically this is what allows like the left-hand side of the brain to control what's happening on the right-hand side of the body. Those axons, when they finally cross sides to get over to the correct side of the body, that's where they're going to be crossing, is at that commissure point. So those are that's the gray matter. With the white matter, these are containing the axons, and within the spinal cord they can be myelinated or unmyelinated. Now, gray matter is referred to as horns, white matter is referred to as a column, and we have three of them. And you'll see their names actually parallel the names that we have with the gray matter. We have the anterior white column, the posterior white column, and the lateral white column. Now, these white columns, like a column on a house, run vertically in the spinal cord. So they contain what we call a tract. Some of these tracts are ascending tracts, that in other words are going from the body up to the brain, and others are descending tracts that contain motor commands that are going out to the body. Now your book does go into more detail with this, but I just want to give you a general sense of this with the spinal cord. We're not going into a ton of specifics simply because its complexity is too high for this level of class. All right, so what we want to do is we actually want to finish off our diagram. All right, so popping those names back up. And then we're going to finish labeling those areas that, those 4 that we had talked about. Now the first one I'm going to do is the dot that's right in the center there of that kind of butterfly shape. That represents the central canal. Now if I look at the butterfly shape, this one here, you can see it's on this side of the spinal cord. Remember, that is the posterior side, so that is going to be your posterior gray horn. And then I actually really like how they diagram this side. So you can see how this one is kind of sticking off to the side. That would be your lateral. And then this one's pointing this way, which would be your anterior. Now, when they actually labeled it over here, it's a little bit more ambiguous because they kind of made it a little bit different shape. But that is actually the anterior gray horn. And so you can see here how I would have the anterior white column here, the lateral white column here, and then up in this area we have the posterior white column. Now, a question I often get asked is about this here. You can see how in these 2 areas that I've circled, it looks different between the 2 diagrams. Basically, this top one has had the meningeal layers peeled away, whereas the bottom one here has them intact. So you can actually see that the roots are actually separate from the spinal cord itself. They are connected in, but they are not fully physically integrated into the spinal cord itself. Now we have a couple of other diagrams that are on here, and this is the next one that you have. And you may want to pause here just to make sure. I know sometimes with the photocopying the numbers don't come through quite as clearly. This diagram is a little bit more detailed than the one that we just labeled. And what we're going to do is you have a lot of room around this diagram to actually basically write a key for this diagram. The one thing I do want to point out here is that, first of all, to orient yourself to the spinal cord, okay, you see the bump here, so you know that this side of the spinal cord is the dorsal side or the posterior side. The other way that you can tell is by looking at the grooves. This one is a lot shallower than the front one. Okay, see how much closer this comes to the central canal than the back one does? So this one has to be the posterior sulcus, and this one has to be the anterior fissure. Sometimes the fissure is shown like this in terms of being a little bit wider, but as you saw in the other one, that's not always the case. So here are the labels for that diagram, numbers 1 through 7, and you may want to pause. And then here is the second set of 8 through 13. Now the last diagram that I have, again, just to show you how you can represent the same information a couple of different ways, is actually one from your textbook. So you can see here we've got the different types of gray horns. It labels the commissures. It looks at the sulcus versus the fissure. Again, it shows the fissure wider. It's got the dorsal root ganglion and the ventral root as well as the dorsal roots attached to the spinal cord. Okay? Now, please do not worry about this stuff over here in terms of the gray horns. We are not going to get that specific in terms of locations on the anatomy. Now, whenever you talk about the spinal cord, people often immediately jump to spinal cord injuries. Now, spinal cord injuries can actually affect either the spinal cord or the cauda equina. It does not have to be simply the spinal cord. It can actually refer to either one. Now, if we have a spinal cord injury, sometimes we can actually have what's called general paralysis. And basically that means that we have some severe damage caused by an auto crash or accident. And this type of damage is very rarely repaired within the spinal cord. You often deal with a crushing or blow type injury to the spinal cord, and so that way then it doesn't really, unfortunately, fix itself because of the nature of the trauma. If we have damage specifically at the 4th or 5th cervical vertebrae, which actually happens up underneath your chin, that's going to eliminate sensation and motor control of both your upper limbs and your lower limbs, and that's referred to as quadriplegia. Quad means 4, and so you have 2 upper limbs and 2 lower limbs, and so that's where it gets its name from. Thoracic level damage results in what we call paraplegia, where the lower limbs have motor control loss. All right, now with any of these spinal cord injuries, we once thought that regeneration of functionality within these injuries was long thought to be impossible. But in the labs, what we have found is that embryonic stem cells implanted within rats who've purposely had spinal cord injuries inflicted upon them, they have been able to regain limb mobility and strength. And this is where some of the controversy and politics come into play, because the government here has always limited or placed limitations on the use of embryonic stem cells. So on the one side, you've got the government and people with certain beliefs about the use of embryonic stem cells not wanting it to happen. But then you have other foundations and people such as Christopher Reeve who have long been fighting to support this research, to try to give these people with spinal cord injuries some return to normalcy in their lives. So this is a debate that spreads well beyond the scientific community, and it's one that has been pretty much on the forefront of some of the scientific research. This is one of the things that we cannot fix yet with modern drugs and modern medicine, so it makes things kind of a challenge and trying to explore these alternative therapies simply because of some of the controversy that is associated with the use of those embryonic stem cells. One of the neat things I have heard about recently is some mechanical methods to stimulate muscle groups to allow them to function. So for instance, it could look like something like a simple knee brace, but you would almost have like a fanny pack attached at your waist, and what that knee brace is actually doing is sending electrical stimulation in a very computerized, methodical fashion to contract your lower leg muscles to cause you to walk. So in essence, it's bridging the gap between your broken, severed spinal cord and the motor neurons. They are working on decreasing the size of that, so it would actually be more of like a sleeve that you would have, that you could wear under clothing, and people really wouldn't be able to tell after a little bit of practice that you were actually wearing it. Especially with some of the nanotechnology that has become available to us recently, this is another growing area of research within physical rehabilitation. All right, so that kind of concludes our discussion on the spinal cord, and we will be talking next about the various diseases that are associated with the nervous system.